Hello, David here at merchantaccounts.ca with another episode of the Vlogcast. So in my 20 years of payments, one of the most exciting products that didn't quite live up to the expectations was the original version of 3DSecure. It promised to help finally protect merchants from online fraud, which was a huge benefit. But the cumbersome checkout process caused so many click-offs that most merchants just wouldn't use it. And the way that it worked was during the checkout process, people get a pop-up window and they had to type in an extra password in order to complete the purchase, which at the time was called verified by Visa or MasterCard secure code. That got abandoned because it basically didn't work that well. So there's now a much improved version of 3DSecure called 3DSecure version 2. Today I'm talking to Josh Cohen from Pay, which is a company that provides 3DSecure authentication services. Josh signed up to answer all of our questions about 3DSecure today. Josh, thanks for joining.
Thanks for having me, David.
So awesome. I'm just going to jump right in here. So was my intro correct, first of all, because I'm not an expert on 3DSecure? Did I get anything wrong there?
Everything sounded good.
Okay, cool. So I'm going to start at the top. I already kind of mentioned it, but I'm just going to ask you, what is the benefit, the main driving benefit of using 3DSecure?
Yeah, so the ultimate reason is with e-commerce merchants, all their credit cards all the transactions rather, are card not present transactions. So all the chargeback liability is on the merchant. And so when they use our 3D Secure in Canada, the US, anywhere outside the EU, they can add this frictionless technology where the user doesn't see any kind of pop-up. It's basically the same checkout experience, but they're able to shift the liability of the majority of their transactions away from them so that if they do become fraud transactions or fraud chargebacks, it's not their problem. They don't have to pay a chargeback or chargeback fee. And instead, the liability gets shifted to the customer's issuing bank.
Which is overdue. Like there's a lot of merchants that feel chargebacks are unfair because the issuer, not to get overly deep into it, but the issuer makes all the money on the interest. They have all the control in the dispute process if a merchant doesn't use 3DSecure. So this finally evens the playing field. In fact, just to go off just a little bit further on this point, one of the classic complaints that merchants had is you could have sold I'm talking from the merchant's perspective. I sold something to someone, like it was obviously them. I sent it to their address. Here's a picture of them, on their Facebook walking around in the t-shirt that they bought, and I still lost my chargeback. And the reason why that can happen sometime is the card issuing bank actually has all of the decision-making control in the chargeback process. And so they don't care about the merchant. They just don't want to hear with an upset customer. So unless you have like an avalanche of overwhelming information, now this is not an always true case, but the card issuers who make the decisions strongly tend to side with the cardholder. And then if a merchant, if you want to take it one step further, you can take it to Visa or MasterCard for binding arbitration, but that's like super expensive and it's a nightmare. So I think 3DSecure or 3DSecure 2, it's like the equalizer, right? Because now at least it's more of a fair and even playing field, and it puts the onus back on the issuer to figure out if they want to take this risk, basically.
Pretty much, yeah. I mean, like you said, the banks will always side with their customers. If the average consumer has obviously more than one credit card, so if that first credit card in the wallet is the Chase Sapphire, they're gonna want to make sure that consumer is always using that Chase Sapphire. So yeah, they're always gonna take their word for whatever story they make up, and so that they just stay a loyal customer to that bank.
Exactly. I mean, 10-second story for some of the viewers might have heard this before, but I had a client that did moving and transportation logistics. A gym closed, and so the owner moved all their gym equipment, and they provided the trucks. They offered to the guy if they wanted them to like strap all the equipment down. He said no. He did all the strapping of the equipment on the truck. The stuff got damaged in transit. So then they helped him submit an insurance claim to his insurer to cover the damage to the equipment. He lost it because he's the one that loaded the equipment. You can't load it improperly, damage it, and then seek an insurance claim. So then after he lost all that, he called his bank and said, hey, this wasn't me. I don't know what these guys are talking about. This is fraud. And my client's like, but like we were on site. Here's pictures of us with the guy, and they lost the chargeback to the card issuer. So sometimes, and that's wrong. And the issuer doesn't always get it so wrong, but some of the cases are crazy. And I strongly see the benefit of 3D Secure, as does any merchant who's ever dealt with fraud or even friendly fraud. I was just gonna ask.
Yeah.
I'm just gonna ask a question. I don't know if you know the answer to this one, but the original version of 3D Secure, I know is still going today. I believe it is. Is it being sunset or phased out officially?
Yeah.
It is. Do you know when that's happening?
It's going to be sunset as of October.
Okay, so 3D2 is the way, and the reason why that happened was all the click offs. So with 3D Secure, I'm just kind of bouncing all over the place here, but does it also protect
All good.
Amex transactions, or is it just Visa and Mastercard?
Yes, American Express and Discover will participate in 3DS as well.
Okay. Now I'm really going to kind of let your expertise shine here. You've used the word frictionless. I've talked about all the friction of back in the day. You had to remember your verified by Visa password, which nobody ever did. So how does frictionless work?
Great, that's an awesome question. So basically, with 2.0, we're able to give the issuer additional on-page data that they can gather behind the scenes without any kind of two-factor authentication. So I'll give you an example. When the customer is checking out and they hit that buy button, before that transaction gets sent to the gateway, we're going to run that authentication. So we ping their issuer. Let's say they're using a Chase Sapphire. So we ping Chase, and then Chase has the ability to see, for example, what kind of device they're using. So it's like if David, if you're using your iPhone, you're using your Chase Sapphire to buy something through your iPhone, they can recognize that and line that up and feel like, okay, this is actually David making the transaction. It's not like a stolen credit card. And so 3DS has multiple data points that they can reference, and each issuing bank has their own proprietary formula of making that authentication. But the idea is that we're giving the bank more confidence that the transaction is legit.
That makes sense. And I think, I actually hadn't thought of this in a little bit, but I don't know the metric. Maybe you do, maybe you don't. You can correct me if you do. The idea back in the day, I think, when Visa approached, or whatever, when the card brands approached the issuers, it's like, hey, you guys are challenging everything. I'm talking about 3D Secure version 1. And it's like, if Dave goes on Best Buy for the third time this month to buy another technical gadget he doesn't need, which I do, why are you challenging him? You know that it's him. And card issuer, you're making this a bad experience for our card holder. And I'm pretty sure they said, I guess my question, Josh, is there a metric? Is it something like 95% of transactions or something are supposed to slide through unchallenged, the frictionless part of the checkout that we're talking about?
So generally, I can only speak anecdotally from the data of my own customers at Pay. But yeah, generally you'll see 70%, 80% frictionless authentication, where either the bank is participating in 3D Secure and they run that authentication, they look at things like IP address and device, and then they respond like, yes, we're comfortable with the transaction. Or, and by the way, that's a status Y, or status A for attempted, and this is how the networks kind of push 3D Secure 2.0 out into the issuer world, is that if the issuer doesn't feel like participating in 3DS and being up to date, then it's a status A for attempted, where basically the card brand will provide the merchant with the 3D Secure response on behalf of the issuer and basically force that authentication and force that liability onto the issuer 100% of the time.
Oh, so it's like issuer, get with the program. You should have been compliant with this, or something along those lines.
Exactly. It's a get with the program kind of thing. So in the first example where the issuer is participating, I mentioned earlier that they have their own proprietary set of rules, and it's kind of unique for each bank. But some things that I see anecdotally are, with participating banks, higher dollar amounts will sometimes result in a challenge more often than like maybe a $50 authentication.
As it should be. There's more risk there, so that
Yeah,
makes
exactly.
sense. So how does the so one of the things I actually know this because I've spoken to a merchant that's integrated the pay service before, and they were telling me about the API. I've never gone hands on with it, and if I tried to, I wouldn't do very well with it. I was a programmer 20 years ago, so enough to be dangerous. But I think there was like 200 things or something. Like these are things that stick out in my mind. It was like they looked at the pixel depth of the device you're viewing the page on. It's like they're collecting or aggregating a lot of data, right? For every transaction that's submitted.
Yeah, yeah. There's a lot of data points that are included in that authentication process.
But it's not hard for it's not like a merchant's doing. So let's talk about pay for a second. So it's not like the merchant's doing 200 heavy lifting things. You guys kind of make it easy to do that somehow.
Yeah, so our old school implementation is our API, which has all those different line items, but the primary implementation that we suggest to our customers is our SDK. And all that is basically, a developer or someone who's at least dangerous like you, David, will go onto the checkout page, tag the fields of where we can get the credit card and expiration date and the amount of what's being authenticated, and then a few different tweaks here and there, and you're basically integrated. And all that heavy lifting is done by the SDK.
Interesting. You know what took me a while to wrap my mind around, and I mean, so I know that you make it easy. And I know that I'm with TD. Okay. So let's just say that I'm doing a $10,000 transaction, at 3 in the morning, and TD's like, okay, this doesn't sound like Dave. A challenge needs to happen. The part that I've had, and I think it's not just me, it's a lot of even knowledgeable people in the industry. How does the issuer control, if they decide to do a challenge, how do they control it? Because it could be like a text. In fact, before you answer the question, I'll give you an example. A friend of mine
Okay.
is British, and because of the PSD2 directive, which we might talk about in a little bit here, it's a European payments directive thing. But 3DSecure is more popular in Europe than in North America, I think. But because of that, when she does purchases, she has her banking app on her phone, and it requires her to scan her fingerprint every time a transaction's being done. And I think, actually, I'm almost certain that is the 3DSecure component. Whereas with TD in Canada, I had someone recently that went live and did a transaction, and they said, hey, you're going to get an email code. Check your email. We'll get a one-time use code, type it in. What I'm curious about, and I don't even know if this is a question or just a rant at this point, but how does the issuer control such a diverse number of interactions through the challenge window? How do you guys handle all that?
So I agree with you. It can be a clunky process. But what we do with our SDK and for merchants, needing PSD2 compliance is that we provide control over an iframe, which is, for those who are less technical, it's kind of like a window that it enables a third party, like data from somewhere else.
You know what I always say, Josh? Think of a picture on Facebook. When you click on a picture and it overlays on the page, that's like an iframe, kind of.
Yeah, okay, that's a much better explanation. But yeah, so we give the merchant full control over the iframe. Typically, I recommend just full screening the iframe. That makes it easy. But you could technically put it next to the checkout form if you so chose to do that. But yeah, so we give that control, and then the issuer will do either a text message or redirect the user to their banking app, and it's I guess it's a little clunky, I would say. That's why in the US the 1.0 3DS, which required stepped up consumer authentication, it didn't really take off so well. But I think with the EU, since the PSD2 directive that you mentioned is kind of forcing everybody to have this, I think the issuers are really upping their game with how smooth that authentication challenge process works.
Okay, Josh, one of my questions is about the challenge itself. because a cardholder can either fail the challenge or the issuer, I don't know, sometimes, like you said, the challenge can be. So I'm with TD. I don't even know if I am enrolled for 3D Secure. So I don't even know how they would challenge me. And I don't do online banking because I'm always afraid I'm going to lose my cell phone and someone just get access to my bank accounts. So if somebody fails the challenge or the card issuer wants to issue a challenge, like if 80% of the time it goes unchallenged, which is great, but 20% of the time it is challenged, what's the best practice? What do you recommend to do to your clients in those scenarios?
So most of my clients are outside of the EU, and so the PST2 requirements don't apply to them. So you can run e-commerce transactions without 3D Secure. So what we do, which is totally compliant, is when we get a frictionless response, whether it's status A for attempted, that means where the bank isn't participating and the brand like Visa, MasterCard is forcing them to authenticate frictionless, or if it's a status Y where the bank signs off and says, hey, this is cool, and they authenticate frictionless. Those are great. We send those in and, we'll see, 60, 70, 80% coverage on approved transactions in the gateway with just those alone. On the steps that require a challenge, if you do a lot of e-commerce shopping in the US and Canada, you rarely see a 3D Secure challenge. So that means that the population here is not so accustomed to filling out a 3D Secure challenge. So what we recommend is to not show that challenge, and our SDK kind of does that by default. So if the issuer decides, when we attempt to authenticate, they are participating, but their algorithm says, oh, we want to challenge this just to make absolutely sure, we'll actually close out that request and then have the merchant send that transaction right to the gateway for authorization without 3D Secure. That way there's no card abandonment, and the merchant can still have a high conversion rate but get a lot of protection with the frictionless 3D Secure.
What you've done is you've utterly and completely reduced the click-offs with that approach. That's interesting, and I think so. This is so interesting. Like I will tell you this, like the head of risk at a well-known payment processor that I work with, they're approving accounts conditional on 3D Secure. Like even the head of risk don't understand how this works. So I think this is such an interesting topic to so many people who hopefully view this someday. So here's a question that I'm going to flip back at you though. So what if you're a high-risk merchant? I had a merchant one time that was selling, it wasn't World of Warcraft, but something like World of Warcraft, like the Sword of Zarnia or whatever like that. And so selling digital goods to young people that have all the time in the world, they're technically proficient, they're dumb enough to use stolen credit cards, like there's certain demographics that are hard to hit. That would be an example of a merchant that might say, hey, like I acknowledge that I have high risk demographic and I don't want to let it slide through. Is there a way to approach it where if the issuer wants a challenge, to force the challenge through, to give them the opportunity, else abandon? It's the actual opposite approach of what you're talking about?
Absolutely, yeah. We give the option to show the challenge, and you can take it a step further and code the page to say, hey, if we're not getting a status A or a status Y, which, by the way, when you get a status C, which is for challenge, when that challenge is successfully completed, it results in a status Y. So you could say, if I'm not getting an A or a Y, I don't want to authorize this transaction. You can absolutely do that.
That's interesting. But you can also handle the challenge. In other words, if the issuer wants to do the challenge, and maybe you just said this, I apologize if I'm just repeating the same question, but people can do the challenge with pay if they wanted to?
100%. They can use our SDK, and we give, through the SDK, the merchant full control over the formatting of the iframe. So I typically recommend full screening the iframe so that it's just like the user just sees the full challenge, and they don't have to scroll, or maybe their iPhone like formats the page in a weird way so that they can't see the challenge. So I always recommend just full screen the challenge. But yeah, we're giving you that control. So if you wanted to put it next to the checkout form, you could do that as well. But yeah, with that control, You're not going to control the actual challenge itself, like if it's a text message or a security question, but you'll control where it's how it's being positioned on your page.
That makes sense. And I'm realizing this conversation with you is helping me to realize that 3D Secure, there's still a lot merchants, there's quite a reasonable amount that merchants can do with it. And I briefly want to talk about PSD2 because we should not throw around acronyms without describing in some sense what it is for our viewers. And I'm going to get this a little bit wrong, so please forgive me, I'm not an expert on it, but it stands for Payment Services Directive 2. So in Europe, the authorities, I don't know what governing body, basically said, hey, businesses, if you are doing e-commerce or card not present transactions, you need a second layer of authentication. One layer is the credit card number, but you need a second layer of authentication, and 3D Secure is the most popular way of accomplishing that. And so it means that in Europe, you're not allowed to, or you're not supposed to, I should qualify this a little bit. My strong understanding, but I'm not 100% certain, is you're not supposed to authenticate a card not present transaction, an e-commerce card not present transaction, without the authentication on the second step, which 3D Secure. Josh, is your understanding roughly about the same as mine on that?
Yeah, it's the fact that the 3D Secure rails that's the only way to do the two-factor authentication, which is required for e-commerce transactions, as a result of the PSD2 directive.
So
it's the only way. It's not like the most popular. That's the only way to do it.
Okay, thank you for that. So if you're a European merchant, for your European merchants, you can't have the option of just dismiss that challenge. It's like if European, you must show the challenge window.
Yeah, and I worked for Pay sort of as this process kind of became more and more adapted, but basically, there would be different countries that all of a sudden the merchant can't approve any transaction, and so then they need 3DS. So I think pretty much everywhere in the EU now, it's like you need 3DS, you need to show the challenge, and otherwise you can't process credit card transactions.
That's right, unless it's a virtual terminal transaction where the merchant is keying in on behalf of the cardholder. So
I think so. I don't even know about the virtual terminal thing.
A virtual terminal, to anybody watching, it's just like, it's where the merchant keys the card data in on behalf of the cardholder, and there is no second layer of authentication there. I actually do know that, so I can speak to that.
Okay, awesome.
So something interesting, I'm wondering if you've ever heard of this. I'm just going to talk about a personal experience that I have. I had a merchant that was using 3D Secure 2. They had a high-risk product. It was the merchant that was selling kind of the in-video game stuff, so it was very high risk. But they were quite happy with 3D Secure. And what was interesting is they still got a big pile of chargebacks. Fraud reason code chargebacks, which shouldn't have been possible. And so what we ended up doing, this is just a tip for anybody that's using 3D Secure, is we opened a file with Visa and basically said, WTF, like this is not real. So, and it's interesting, card issuers, in my experience, don't always comply with the rules they are obligated to comply with. And if you are using 3D Secure and it's a fraud reason code chargeback, you should push back on that. I don't know if you've ever heard of that, Josh, but I actually did see it happen to a merchant. And you might not, because you're not on the processing side of the business, but in the end, they were made whole, and it did protect the merchant when the dust settled.
That's really interesting. Well, I am on the client side of processing, and so when somebody who I just sold a product that will prevent chargebacks gets a bunch of chargebacks, I'm definitely made aware of those situations. But typically, it's an integration issue that's causing that. So if everything is set up properly, meaning the gateway is compatible to accept 3DS, and the processing platform behind that gateway is also compatible, and a transaction gets 3D secured, whether it's status A or Y, and all the fields are passing properly, and the reason code is fraud, there is no chargeback. So I would potentially, I wasn't in that conversation, but yeah, if you're getting a chargeback on a fraud reason code, there's something from an integration perspective that's incorrect.
Yeah. Actually, you know what it was? Sorry to cut in there.
Sorry, go ahead.
In this case, the integration was proper. It's just the issuers dropped the ball. They did win it, but basically, it was an example. This is probably just a good tidbit for people to know. Even when you do everything right, sometimes other parties, particularly the issuers, can make mistakes. So 3D Secure, it did protect them. It took they had they not had it, they would have lost all those chargebacks. It was many thousands of dollars. In fact, it was a happy news story in the end. It was just interesting. And this actually is a good time for me to point out that 3D Secure doesn't prevent all chargebacks. Josh,
Right.
it's the reason code of fraud. Is that correct?
Yeah, so for Visa, that's 10-4, and the MasterCard has two reason codes, 4837, 4863.
And these would be basically not authorized, cardholder, not authorized type transactions.
Yeah, like cardholder does not recognize, or unauthorized transaction, or fraud. All those reason codes are protected.
Perfect.
And kind of going back to your first story, about how it's so easy to just call the bank up and make up some kind of narrative or some story that someone stole your credit card when you obviously made the transaction. That's the culture that we live in, where the bank is just like the money machine, and you can just call up and get your free money. So 90% of the chargebacks that we see with our clients are due to these fraud reason codes, because that's the easiest way to get your money back from the bank. Just say, hey, I didn't authorize this, and you got the money back.
It's so true. And listen, I always say, like, 99% of people, I think the world is a better place than people think. It's the problem that, like, the 1% of people that are jerks can really cause things. Here's a funny short story. When I first got into e-commerce payments, like a zillion years ago, I wanted to go through the process of selling a physical product. So I had a website, beanbag chairs, selling leather beanbag chairs. I imported them from Brazil. 20 years ago, I was a gamer, and I wanted a beanbag chair that wasn't like a 12-year-old Walmart beanbag chair. So they were really cool. Like, they were ginormous leather beanbag chairs. I wouldn't be interested today, but I was very interested 20 years ago. But I sold them, and I'll never forget, I got this request one time. I sold a leather beanbag chair, and like 6 years later, I got a call from someone one time, and they're like, "Hi, I'm going to be sending my chair back for a refund." And I'm like, "Oh, okay. What's your order?" And I look it up, and it was like 5 or 6 years previous. And I'm like, "Well, your order was like 6 years ago." And they're like, "Yeah, I know. I'm going to go ahead and return that now. We didn't use it that much, and I could use the money." And I'm like, "Well, you did use it for half a decade, so I don't know that I can return your money." But if they had any option, I was on the phone with someone completely unreasonable. And I'm not, listen, this person might have been in a desperate situation. If you're trying to refund things from 5 or 6 years ago, you're probably in a pretty desperate situation. So I shouldn't make too light of the situation. But in fairness to me as a business owner, it's like, sometimes you deal with people that are unreasonable. And you're right, the card issuers, going back to our original point, the card issuers made it way too easy. They were way too cardholder friendly, and the merchants were getting burned left, right, and center. So I would call 3D Secure the great equalizer on that front. And I think it's a super important service, especially for merchants got a high risk or a high ticket. Here, Josh, I'm going to ask you a question. What type of merchant should implement, sorry, my rant's almost over. What type of merchant should use 3D Secure? In particular, like, what are the merchants that should definitely be using 3D Secure?
So definitely anyone with a chargeback ratio over 1%.
That makes, and I would also throw out there, like, so if I have a merchant that sells pencil crayons and another merchant that sells Rolexes, if you're selling the Rolexes, use 3D Secure.
So I just would caution the Rolex, because there are, Visa has a program called the Visa Fraud Monitoring Program. And if the merchant exceeds a certain dollar amount of 3DS fraud, and also that 3DS fraud is at a certain ratio of, like a certain threshold of ratio compared to its 3DS approved transactions, then they do get into a fraud program, which is not good for the merchant. So, yeah, authenticating $30,000 watches, obviously depending on the volume, because it's a ratio, but it could potentially not be a good fit for someone selling Rolexes. But someone selling smaller ticket items, anywhere like $50, $100, $200, even up to $500, yeah, and their fraud ratio is over 1%, then definitely use 3D Secure.
Let's talk about that a little bit more, because the fraud ratio, I'm going to assume that there's a merchant, the same merchant owns two businesses, because I want to take the human part of it out of it. Okay. And either in the sense that they approach each business ethically and responsibly. And with one, they're selling pencil crayons, like decorative, like calligraphy pens that are $200 a pen. That's a good example. And then they're also selling Rolexes. I'm just going to keep on going with Rolexes here. If it was me, and maybe you can clarify this for me, because the risk of you sell a $200 pen and your cost is $150, your real loss is $150, which stinks, but that doesn't hurt so bad. But you lose a $30,000 Rolex, well, that's a couple nights sleep, a couple hard stiff drinks, and forget about that one. So, like, wouldn't 3D Secure be a better fit for those merchants, assuming that you approach, like, you're not haphazard about your orders? But you mentioned a 3D Secure chargeback, but you can't get a 3D. I just want to better understand your advice there. It was actually quite interesting to me.
Yeah, so the 3D Secure chargeback concept, it's a thing. The merchants don't get chargebacks on fraud reason codes that are protected with 3D Secure, but they are technically still disputes that customers are calling their banks with and filing, and they do get resolved, but it's the issuing bank that pays the bill. So Visa keeps track of these disputes, and if a merchant has too many 3D Secure disputes from a dollar amount perspective, and both criteria need to be satisfied, and a threshold perspective, then that merchant gets put into a program. But I would imagine someone selling Rolexes has probably a high cap if they're doing, if they have a significant watch business, and they probably will only get like one chargeback, but it's a painful chargeback. And so it could be that it is a good fit because that one chargeback only represents, whatever, 10 basis points of their overall fraud exposure. And in which case I would definitely use 3D Secure. But it is something to be aware of, and I would consult any high ticket merchant, from a numbers perspective to see what kind of fraud exposure they have before recommending 3D Secure to them.
That's so interesting. I genuinely, for anybody that might not totally understand what Josh is saying, Visa and MasterCard do monitor chargeback rates on merchants and even on payment processors. Anybody who's getting too many disputes, that's a bad thing. And what Josh is saying is that you might be winning your chargeback. You might not be seeing the chargebacks, but if too many disputes come in, even though you're winning, Visa's basically saying, hey, 3D Secure is protecting you, but we're not happy with how many disputes you're getting. Is that a good summary, Josh?
Yeah, how many and what percentage of your overall business they represent.
That's right. But I would still say, if I had a Rolex merchant, if I was a Rolex merchant, you better believe I'd be signed up at, the first minute of the day. I do not want, the bigger the ticket to me, the more you want to be protected. So I would rather make Visa and MasterCard upset at me and go on a monitoring program that I would want to eat those losses. And as a payment processor at merchantaccounts.ca, if you have an issue that comes along, it's not like Visa's the hammer of God falling out of the sky. Sometimes it seems that way, but there's reasonableness to it. And it'd be more like, what are you doing? How are you rectifying this? Like to a merchant, I would say protect yourself. And Josh, your service at Pay for high ticket merchants, I think is actually a really, it's probably the best service that high ticket value merchants can implement, because you don't want to eat those losses.
Yeah. Definitely.
Yeah. So that's interesting. So you just threw a curveball at me. I learned something. Thank you for that. Is there anything else that we should know about 3D Secure or 3D Secure version 2? Or not, but I'm going to just throw it over to you if you have any more advice there.
I think we covered pretty much everything.
Josh, I know people might be interested in learning more about Pay. Maybe you could tell people where to go, how to get in contact with you or the company.
Yeah, you go to our website, paay.co, for more information, or you could email me, josh@pay.co.
Perfect. And I'm going to put the hyperlink in the description. Josh, this was super interesting. I am almost certain that if anybody came into this video not knowing a lot about 3DSecure, they would have learned a lot. I really appreciate you taking the time and helping us out today.
Well, thanks for having me, David. It's been a pleasure.
Perfect. Thanks, Josh.